Well, if you remember where we left off previously, we were discussing how to plan for both spoken and written messages. And we're going to pick right back up where we left, and we're going to continue with how to prepare both spoken and written messages. If you remember from last time, we specifically discussed determining the purpose for our message as well as selecting the appropriate channel. We talked about envisioning the audience as well as adapting our message to the needs and the concerns of our audience. And then lastly, we discussed how to organize our messages. Now we're going to continue with actually preparing those messages themselves. So we're going to go from the planning phase in which we're trying to gather information, determining the appropriateness of our channel, how we're going to communicate that, whether or not we're going to use deductive or inductive reasoning when we're writing our actual work. But we're going to go ahead and we're actually going to start crafting the body of our message, essentially, either if it's spoken or if it's written. And this is an important part, obviously, because this dictates what the message is. And so there's two steps that are encompassed in this. The first of which is preparing the first draft. And the reason I say preparing the first draft is because many times in writing you have multiple drafts, particularly if you're writing formal business type reports. Usually the first thing that you put down on paper, the first thing that you type into your computer isn't the finished product. Usually it's a process that you go through to consistently tweak and change certain things and polish up your writing. The same thing if you've ever delivered any type of presentations in public, whether they're in a business type setting or not necessarily in a business setting. Usually when you're trying to craft the speaking points that you're going to mention, usually there's things that change over the course of when you're practicing the actual delivery piece. You find certain things don't really sound right and you want to add certain content, maybe something isn't necessary. And so it's completely fine for the first thing that we put on paper to not necessarily be the end result. In fact, that's the right idea. That's actually preferred. So there's a couple of things I want to discuss with regards to these two steps here that should give you a little more information in terms of how to improve ultimately your written and spoken communication. So the first of which I have here is rapid versus deliberate writing. There's a lot of change or different schools of thought with regards to how people should write. You have the camp that suggests that rapid writing is preferred. In that case, the goal is to just simply put words on paper, to start typing, because it's always easier to go ahead and make revisions later on as opposed to trying to make sure that we get everything right the first time. And then there's the camp that proposes that deliberate writing is more ideal, that doing things right the first time saves you a lot of headache later on. Personally, I feel that rapid writing is appropriate for a majority of situations. And I say a majority because a lot of times there are time constraints that don't allow you to prepare multiple drafts. If that's the case, then deliberate writing would be more appropriate because you're making sure and you're producing a quality product the first time because you don't necessarily have the luxury of producing multiple drafts. And a lot of times, especially in the business world, that's really how it works. But if we do have the opportunity to take the time and review, rapid writing would be preferred because this helps prevent what we were often refer to as writer's block, where we simply can't think of what to say because we're literally just putting things on paper with the mindset that it's always easier to come back and edit the document rather than try to create something entirely from scratch. And I'm not sure if you've actually tried this practice before. I have, and have had a lot of success with it, so I can personally vouch for it because I too sometimes struggle with trying to communicate something, especially if it's in writing and I have some trouble kind of figuring what I want to communicate. And once I have something on paper and I pick it back up and review it the next day, it's always easier to make those changes and to kind of move forward with it, at least for myself. And you may be different, but I've had a lot of success using that type of style with the rapid writing style, making changes later on. And this allows you, every time you look at it, you have a fresh perspective, you got a fresh set of eyes. And so usually what you do is you spot some errors, you spot different ways of wording something as a way of communicating it more effectively, which is ideal, obviously. The next thing you need to consider is writing with an active voice. We write a lot in what we refer to as passive voices, and I'll give you an example of what this is. An active voice is written where the actor in the sentence is actually doing something. Okay, they're actually doing something. So for example, if I were to say Dave washed the car, okay, the actor in this sentence is obviously Dave. Dave is doing something. He's washing the car. Okay. If I were to convert this to a passive voice, I would say something along the lines of the car was washed by Dave. Now, in this new sentence, the actor is obviously the car. But the car isn't really doing anything. It's just sitting there. It's actually getting washed by someone else. And so that is an example of what a passive voice would be when you're crafting a sentence. Now, passive voices aren't necessarily bad all the time. The problem is when we tend to over-rely on them, it changes the style of our writing. It makes it very difficult to read, makes it very bureaucratic, almost stuffy, which can be very difficult for someone to read. And remember, if the purpose of our writing is to try to communicate something so that someone will understand what it is that we're saying, then we ultimately want to make it easy for the other person to understand what our message is. And so if you can, writing in an active voice is much more preferred. It makes your writing easier to understand than obviously writing in a passive voice. So do so, and that will definitely improve the readability of your writing. The next thing is using contractions, and people go back and forth on using contractions. You know, we use them a lot when we speak, obviously, because it's a lot more efficient and it just seems to flow more naturally. But we don't necessarily use them in writing, and I don't know why personally, because really the whole purpose of writing is we should, and I say should because we don't, but I say we should write the way that we speak ultimately, because that is what's going to communicate more effectively. But oftentimes when we write, we try to think, well, what are the biggest words that I can use? How can I impress the other person with the breadth of my grammar and all the different words that I know? Well, once again, if we're looking at it from the standpoint of I understand who my reader is and I'm going to write towards their readability level or their reading level, then obviously I want to make things easier for them, because if they don't understand my writing, well, it's not very effective then, and that's really my fault. It's not theirs. So using contractions, I think, is completely fine. Some people do not like them. I've seen some English professors actually notate that, you know, you shouldn't use a contraction. They're completely fine. There's nothing wrong with them. If anything, it makes your writing flow a little more accurately, and then we use them obviously in our speech as well. So why not use them in writing is my stance. And then lastly, what I'll discuss here is varying your sentence and your paragraph length. We need to be careful, and I see this a lot in that we get used to a certain structure of a sentence, certain length, using the certain words, and we begin to replicate that periodically throughout our writing. And that gives you a very kind of stale look. It's very boring for the reader because they're essentially reading the same thing over and over, just the words are a little different. So you want to get in the habit of varying your sentence and your paragraph length. You don't want all of your sentences to be really small, because then you probably run into some issues with fragmented sentences and not developing ideas. But you don't want sentences that go on for 18, 25 words, because then those get really difficult to understand. And then especially if you're trying to communicate something to someone who may not be interested in the first place, they're going to check out right away and they're not going to read any further because it's taking too much effort. And so you want to make it easier for people to go through your writing, to read through it, and to understand it. So in order to keep people engaged, what I recommend is varying the length of your sentences as well as paragraphs. You don't need to necessarily make them a standard cookie cutter length, but vary them. Some can be longer. You know, and by longer, I mean 16 words. That's usually as long as I would go. Anything longer than that, and you're going to likely introduce errors, or it's going to be difficult for the reader to comprehend, depending upon who your reader is or who your listener is. But then you don't want everything being very long, so you want to kind of sprinkle in some shorter sentences to vary the length up. That way, it's engaging to the reader and it kind of keeps them interested. Now, assuming that we've prepared our first draft obviously our first, sometimes even our second and our third, isn't the final product. What we have to do is we have to go through and revise and proofread our drafts for accuracy. And this is a very, very important part. Unfortunately, a lot of times we skip through this just for time constraints and, not obviously wanting to be patient and follow through with the process and to put something out there and get a finished product ready to go. But the revision piece is extremely pivotal because ultimately your writing or speech is a reflection of you. Whether or not it's accurate, if you write a piece of a certain article or a position paper or research paper, and it's completely littered with grammatical errors and spelling errors, and the sentence structures are very monotonous and the same, and it's written entirely from a passive voice, your content could be good. You could have very, very good content in terms of what you're actually saying, but the way in which you communicate it will make it so that your reader is essentially turned off, which obviously is not ideal. Ultimately, that writing is a reflection of you as well. Even if you're a completely intelligent and capable person, people are going to judge you based upon what your writing is or what your speech is, even if they don't have any prior knowledge of your background and all those other things. And so ultimately we want to put our best foot forward. We want to make sure and we convey the information that we want to and in the manner that we want it interpreted. And that's an important part here. So a couple things that you can do in the revision process. This is not all inclusive, but these are just a few things that you can do immediately to help proofread your writing for accuracy and increase your communication effectiveness. First thing is writing or using readability statistics. These don't get used very often, but they are offered in many word processing software packages. I know Microsoft Word offers a similar type package here. And readability statistics are very useful because they essentially determine how difficult it is to read your writing. Some common indexes that you'll see in readability statistics are the Flesch-Kincaid readability index, and that essentially gauges how difficult your writing is. It gives you a numerical score, and then that essentially equates to a grade level, okay? And so that helps determine how difficult it is to read, which is very helpful because if you're considering the education level and the background of your audience, you want to make sure that your writing is consistent with that level. You don't want to necessarily write above the heads of your readers, otherwise no one's going to understand anything. So this is very, very good. You can also see statistics that tell you the average, of your words that you use. Okay, so it'll tell you roughly how long your words are. Okay, so obviously if you're getting to where it's 7, 8, 9 characters is the average, then you may have an issue where your writing is very complicated. You may want to reduce some of those. They also tell you your average sentence length. So you can see ultimately, are we varying our sentence length? Are we, 20, 25 words in a sentence, which is far too long or far too many? Or are we more of the 5 or 6 or 7, which might be too few? So these are things that, although they may not be able to tell you instantaneously if your writing is difficult or if you're varying your sentence structure, they will at least give you a good pulse or a good idea if you're headed in the right direction. And then you can, of course, go through, read through the document and find out what the issues are there. So definitely good for highlighting some major issues there. I encourage you to use it. Very easy, and it scans the entire document real quick, so you don't have to go through and count how many words there are in each particular sentence, because that would be very, very cumbersome. The next thing you want to consider during the revision process is the visual appeal of your writing. Very, very important. We stress content a lot, even to a fault almost. Content is good. Content is king. But if there was a queen, it would certainly be the visual appeal aspect. And you've probably been in similar situations where either the material was good, but the way it was communicated was something that almost made you disengage, or if you were reading something and it was just so difficult to read, even if the content was very, very interesting, that you completely disengaged from it and didn't read further. So the visual appeal is very, very important. Cannot emphasize that enough. if I were to produce a paper and it was just one entire block of text, there was no white space whatsoever on this page, chances are you would probably not want to read that because it's very intimidating. It's very overwhelming. And so knowing that, you want to go ahead and go through and take some steps to actually change the structure of your paper, even if it's saying the same thing, right? We're communicating the same thing. We're not changing content. We're just changing the look of how our writing is, the visual appeal of it. So what are some things that you can do? One of the easiest things is including some type of bulleted list. Those bullets that you see in Microsoft Word or the word processing software that you use are very common. Bulleted lists are great if you're trying to communicate more than one of something. So maybe more than one proposal, more than one recommendation, more than one item. So they're very, very useful because you write the first part of the sentence, possibly a semicolon, obviously tab down, enter a bullet, and enter each of the items there. And you can research on your own ultimately how to structure those. You can use commas. You don't have to use commas. Whatever you do, just be consistent, obviously, throughout the body of your writing. But those are very good because they allow for what we call white space. And white space is very visually appealing. If I look at a paper and it's entirely just text, instantly I don't want to read it. Even if it is a great paper, has great content, visually it doesn't look good to me. It looks very intimidating. And so you do want some white space intermingled into the paper there because it's not as intimidating to readers or to viewers, and it just increases the visual appeal of your writing in general. So bulleted lists certainly work. Headings are another thing that works very well. By headings, I mean, obviously enlarging the text and then maybe boldening it in certain areas. And headings work great because they delineate or separate between certain changes in thought or changes in paragraph, changes in idea. And they communicate to your reader that a certain area of text is related to one idea. And then you have a new header, and that obviously conveys that you're switching thoughts. You're going to be talking about a new thing. And so instantly, when I look at a paper that includes headers, one, I know that the writer went through the trouble of trying to make it visually appealing and easier on myself because it provides essentially a roadmap of what we're going to cover. I don't necessarily have to hunt through an entire forest of text. I know based upon the headers that we're discussing these 3 or 4 things. Very visually appealing, very easy for readers to understand and to get the direction of where you're going. Another thing that I'll highlight before we move on is the use of tables and graphs. Okay? Tables and graphs are great for conveying quantitative information, numbers, things that it would be very, very difficult to list in paragraph form. It would probably be easier to actually go ahead and create a table or some type of chart or graph to convey that information. We live in a very visual society, and so using those tools are a great way to get your point across and to make it easier for your reader to understand the information, to ultimately consume the information and to understand it, which obviously is the purpose of our writing. All right, the last thing that I'll mention before we end our time here is technology is great. Obviously, we've made great improvements, but you do need to understand the limitations of technology. Relying solely on spelling checkers or grammar checkers will not produce a good quality document. And the reason is you're relying on a computer program which is based upon certain rules that were programmed into it to understand everything that you're trying to communicate, which grammar checkers will spot a lot of different things, but they will miss a lot of things as well. Okay? And so it's important not to rely solely on those, to actually go through and to read your document yourself, hopefully at a different sitting when you have a fresh set of eyes, and spot those different errors that you see that maybe you didn't see beforehand. Okay? Another great thing that you can do as well, and I've always done in my writing, particularly with formal reports and papers and proposals, is I've had someone that I trust actually read through it. Can be a spouse, friend, sibling, parent, whomever, someone that you trust that has obviously good writing skills. That would be beneficial, of course, right? Because the whole idea is we don't want to give it to somebody who's going to say it's great. We want them to find things that are wrong with our writing because that's what's going to help us improve. So having someone you trust read through the document is very beneficial because we need to be receptive to criticism. Even though it's something that maybe we missed or maybe it could be better, it's all meant for the purpose of improving our document and ultimately improving our communication in general. So adhering to those guidelines will help you prepare more successfully, I might add, in speaking as well as writing. It's very, very important. As I said, a lot of times, especially if you're crafting something like a cover letter or a resume, the person on the other end, they don't know you. They don't know who you are, your work ethic. And so they're going to judge you based upon the quality of your writing and the information that you conveyed. And so do yourself a favor, put forth the time and the energy up front to make sure and you produce a good quality document.